I want to preface all of my statements about gaming with my history as a gamer to get my perspective. I started playing video games as a child in the late 80s. I played video games from the Nintendo Entertainment System in the late 80s up until the early 2000s console cycle with the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and the GameCube. That window is most of my gaming life. I went from the Nintendo Entertainment System to the Sega Genesis to the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 up to the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and the Xbox. I was a console gamer. I didn't play PC games really. The only PC game I can remember playing as a youth was Deus Ex in 2000. I was curious about that game, but I most of my life I played console games. My parents had no problem buying the consoles for me. Um, my stepfather in the mid 90s, every time a new console would come out, he would buy one for him and buy one for me, you know, because he played console video games, with the PlayStation and the PlayStation 2. Every time that stuff came out, he would buy one for him and one for me. I stopped playing video games around 2005 because personally I stopped having fun playing video games. And that was around a period of time when I had left home for the first time and I had um, joined the military and I was living on my own and my life circumstances had changed and I just didn't have time for video games anymore and I just lost interest in it. From 2005 up until 2020, I virtually didn't play video games that whole period of time. So there was a whole cycle of gaming that I missed. The PlayStation 3 is totally alien to me, And I in 2020, during the pandemic, I started working from home, and my stepfather bought me a PlayStation 4. I would have never bought it myself. He, for some reason, bought it for me on my birthday and thought I might get a kick out of that game and let me borrow some of the games that he had, and he wanted to test me to see if I like some of these games, then eventually I would buy my own PlayStation 4 games and get back into gaming. And working from home, I had a lot of time to play the games. And working from home, I realized how much gaming had improved since I stopped playing video games. And there were some games I thoroughly enjoyed. Um, from 2020 to 2022 when I was working from home, I played a lot of games that I hadn't played before that came out around the time I stopped playing up until 2020. The video gaming had improved in terms of controls. Controls now with video games are never the issue. When I was playing video games earlier, especially towards the end of the late 90s and into the early 2000s, when three-dimensional games were still, in their infancy, controls were the main issue. Sometimes the games would have bad graphics, but the controls often were the main problem with the bad camera angles or the tank controls that were frustrating. Games today, the controls are never frustrating. That's the best thing about video games today. The gameplay is smooth, the controls are never frustrating. The graphics are never the issue. But what I learned very early on in being reintroduced to gaming is that the problem now is something that started in the 2000s or in the early 2000s and had only gotten worse by the time I returned in 2020. And the problem is the storytelling in video games and distracting you from the gameplay itself. Game developers who seem to be not interested in making a video game exactly, and the gaming industry's impulses or regarding what gamers want to play or what trends that they're following. That seems to be the greatest problem in video games now. In the early 2000s, there were a lot of people who were annoyed by video games' increasing use of CGI cutscenes that interrupt the action and how long the cutscenes were and the ones you couldn't skip. And I remember a segment on extended play, I think in 2002, where they had a segment criticizing the cutscenes in Metal Gear Solid 2 and how they interrupted the gameplay, how a cutscene would occur and then you would get control of the character, then walk down a hallway and then another cutscene would occur, and how you didn't really get going as a gamer because the story keeps intruding on your experience. That the game developers seem to be more interested in making a movie than a video game. Now of course, video games have always had a small connection to Hollywood in the respect that there have always been like movie tie-in games, but in the past they were always of low quality and easily ignored. You know, now to me, the gaming industry is an extension of Hollywood. Everything that it becomes a trend in Hollywood now, it becomes a trend in the video game industry. Game developers all want to be filmmakers now instead of game developers. And because they want to be filmmakers, they all seem to incorporate every staple of Hollywood liberal douchebag entertainment. Every cliche that you can find in Hollywood movies, you'll find in video games now. Every quota that needs to be filled, you find it in these video games, and nothing feels natural. You feel like you're watching a product. And and they play both sides because they have the liberal BS, but they also have the video game industry is also jingoistic and militaristic to appeal to right wingers, with all of the countless series about militias, U.S. forces going into other countries to kill the bad guys. They've been doing that for like a couple of decades now with the Call of Duty, SOCOM, Ghost Recon, Rainbow Six, Splinter Cell stuff. Like that stuff's been going on for long. So the gaming industry, you appeal to liberal douchebags, but you also want to appeal to right wing nuts too. And and I recently played a game, Days Gone, that seemed to also be playing to both sides. Regarding the lead character, the bland lead character, and his girlfriend, and stuff that comes out of her mouth is supposed to appeal to the liberals, but at the same time, it seems to the whole scenario of the game is designed to appeal to right wing nuts because they always dream about the apocalypse and the scenario in Days Gone and Walking Dead and all that garbage. You know and the game fills all the quotas of what Hollywood movies always need to have. And this desire to be filmmakers, a few years ago, I thought the worst example was The Last of Us Part Two. More recently, I played Alan Wake 2, and that's might even be a better example of dickheads in the gaming industry that want to be filmmakers instead. And Alan Wake 2 was just an endurance test of just bullshit, bad, surrealist art film bullshit. It was just a bad art film turned into a video game, and it was hard to endure that game. But The Last of Us Part Two was the first time that I can recall playing a game where the game, as great as the gameplay was, it was ruined by the story. The Last of Us, the series The Last of Us, is the first time that I ever hated a character that I was playing as, and it affected me playing where I'm playing as somebody and I don't want to play as them. That's from the ending of the first game into the second game, where I didn't like what the character was doing, I didn't agree with what they were doing, but I'm being forced to play as someone that I don't like. That had never happened to me as a child or as a teenager. I never recall ever playing a video game where I hated the character I was playing as. That's only in playing a game in the 2020s. It was a bizarre experience to me because that series was so, to me, those games were so mean spirited and dreary with these flat unlikable characters. Because I expect a protagonist in a video game is usually either a blank slate like Master Chief or the protagonist of Half-Life or something like that, someone who's not a character, or even the woman in Alien Isolation. To me, even though she's the daughter of Ellen Ripley, she's a blank slate. She's not a character. I'm fine with that. Or the protagonist is some archetypal hero figure like Solid Snake or Lara Croft or somebody like that. The people in The Last of Us were not weren't either of those. They were just flat, unlikable people doing things that I don't agree with or like in a world that I never want to go back to. I played The Last of Us and I played The Last of Us Part 2, and I definitely would never play, even though the gameplay was great, the gameplay that was taken directly from Uncharted, I would never play either one of those games again because I would never want to re-enter that world. So the idea that they actually remade and remastered and keep re everything regarding the Last of Us games is bizarre to me that anybody would play it once and want to play it again because the world those games take place in is an awful world. And clearly the people behind The Last of Us after the first game were convinced that they were serious artists. You know, that the response that that first game got where people thought it was just so incredibly deep and emotional and all that bullshit, and no, and the developers got full of themselves and they thought they were serious artists. Because me personally, the way that first game ended, I felt like the ending was a reference to The Godfather, where Michael Corleone's wife asked him if it was true that he had his brother-in-law killed, and he lied to her and said no. You know, and that's basically how The Last of Us ends. And that ending, when the second game came out and they had that part two on the end of it, I assumed that the second game was going to be referencing The Godfather Part 2. Because the game developers who want to be filmmakers, of course, these assholes would do that. And I was expecting what was going to be the Godfather references. But of course, The Last of Us Part 2 has parallel stories and flashbacks, and the worst, who ever thought of the idea of a video game with a flashback structure being a good idea? you know Not just one cliche, overlapping cliches, multiple, you know love triangles, uh, revenge quests, the white person going native stories, all just so many cliches overlapping with each other. And the pacing, because of the flashbacks and start ending one story and then starting another one to reach to do for playing as one girl for hours and then stopping and then starting as the other girl, the pacing was terrible. And like, who thought that that was a good idea? Again, people that was so full of themselves after the success of the first game, they thought they could do no wrong. And because gaming now is the budgets are so much larger and these games are so much more expensive to make. The bigger the budget, often, um, just like in Hollywood, they try to fit too much story into the game just because the thing costs so much. And The Last of Us Part 2 is a great example of that. That sort of mentality that so many movie franchises have with a last film in a series where they're like, this is the last one we're going to make, so we're going to just cram everything we can into this. And I said, even before The Last of Us Part 2, I felt that Batman Arkham Knight had that same sensibility where they like, this is the last Batman Arkham game, so we're going to cram as much shit into this game as we possibly can. When the game should have been about Batman versus the Arkham Knight, you have to throw in the Joker, you have to throw in Scarecrow, you have to throw in all this other bullshit, and none of it is satisfying when it should have just been Batman versus the Arkham Knight to make it different from the previous game. The Joker died in the last game, and yet they still found a way to cram him into that game. And the game was just so clumsy and too many threads rather than focusing on something. And so many movie franchises, by the time they get to the last one, it's the same mentality. It's the same mentality of the Batman and Robin, Spider-Man 3, Dark Knight Rises shit, where they get to a last one and they cram so much shit into it and that the whole thing just falls apart. And I never thought I'd see the day where the video game industry would so directly emulate Hollywood in that way. Even like Uncharted 4, where that game I felt like they didn't know what the story was about. Like I thought it was a brother story, and then they bring back the girl from the first game and it ends with him married to her, and you're playing as their child. Like the game starts off like about one thing and then it ends like it's about something else. Like they didn't know what the game was about. And rather than focusing on one thing, it's like they always try to cram so much stuff into a game. And that's a problem with big budgets because games today cost so much. The more expensive a production is, usually the more bland it is and the more full of cliches it is to appeal to a mass audience. That goes back to like Terminator 2 versus the first Terminator. Terminator 2 cost $100 million versus the first one cost like $5 million. So Terminator 2 had to appeal to a wider audience, so it had to be more condescending to the audience, has to preach to the audience and treat the audience like idiots, which the first film didn't do. The concept of remasterings and remakes of video games has also been something that's just kind of slapped me in the face since I returned to video games. Because when I'm playing the PS4, I noticed how many games that came out on the PS3 that were remastered for the PS4. And as my stepfather pointed out when he handed me a remastered copy of The Last of Us, he pointed out that the graphics of PS4 games didn't look that much better than the graphics of PS3 games. So remastering it didn't make any sense. It looked the same. So it was a blatant con to get people to rebuy the same stuff. And some people might say, oh, well, this system isn't backwards compatible, so this gives people the ability to play this game rather than have to go and buy a PS3 console to play it. But that's bullshit. Even worse, remasterings of PS2 and PS1 games I start to notice more recently, which is even more ridiculous to me. I mean, glossing up something old and selling it as if it was something new is always criminal. It's like the Hollywood always trying to get people to keep rebuying movies over and over again with every new video format, from VHS to Laserdisc to DVD to Blu-ray to 4K. Like, how much more high resolution can picture get? How many more times are people going to keep buying the same movie over and over again? You know? And the whole idea of remastering, it's that Star Wars special edition syndrome. You know, the idea that this obsession with graphics alone or effects alone, as if that's going to make something better. You know, this obsession with graphics alone to me is is one of the things that is ruining video games. And that people think that the graphics are the most important thing. And the whole idea of remakes seems to be motivated by that idea. Because to me, a wave of remakes is always the product of a lack of new ideas. That the game developers are as bankrupt when it comes to imagination as assholes in Hollywood. They're totally out of ideas. You know? So the idea of going back to games made in the 2000s or even in 2010s and remaking them is like a popular thing now, and I find it ridiculous. Like, are all games from the 2000s dated to people today? I mean, I'm 41 years old. To a 25-year-old, is a game from 2005 dated? I mean, I played the original God of War just a couple of years ago. I played that game, and it holds up very well. To a 25-year-old, it's hard for me to imagine that game doesn't look good enough to where you have to remake God of War. It's ridiculous to me. I mean, Resident Evil 4 is one of the most important video games ever made, one of the most imitated video games ever made, and modernizing Resident Evil 4 with a remake is bullshit to me. I mean, modernizing Resident Evil 4, the idea of it is like modernizing Jaws by remaking it with a realistic looking CGI shark. It's ridiculous. I mean, remaking PS1 games makes sense to me. Remastering bullshit is that's nonsense. Remaking PS1 games is something else. That makes sense. Like the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 were good, especially 2. And they felt like, even though they looked drastically different from the original Resident Evil 2 and 3, they still felt like Resident Evil. And and I like those. Um, a couple years ago, I also played Silent Hill 2 again. And the original Silent Hill 2 on the PlayStation, and that game holds up like God of War or Resident Evil 4. Silent Hill 2 holds up very well, that game. So why did somebody remake Silent Hill 2? Why remake Silent Hill 2 and not Silent Hill 1? Silent Hill 1 was probably the most dated one of the ones in the series. Not that it wasn't great at the time, but it's more dated than Silent Hill 2 is. It would have made more sense to remake Silent Hill 1. Remaking Silent Hill 2 is just, I mean, it makes no sense to me. Say, why not remake Dino Crisis or Parasite Eve or Fear Effect or, you know, my favorite series of games were the Siphon Filter games on the PS1. Why not remake those games? Those games had terrible graphics. You can make those games look a lot better. That wouldn't be wasting your resources. Remaking Silent Hill 2 is a total waste of resources to me. Because when you're remaking a game that's already great, just like with remaking films, it makes no sense to remake a film that's already great if you're just going to do it the same way. I mean, there are so many concepts to explore and make a video game out of if people actually were willing to make a real investment and show some imagination. I'm like to this day, I'm still baffled by the fact that no one has really put any money, real money, into a Starship Troopers game. There have been games, Starship Trooper games made, but they're always cheap and easily dismissed. No one ever put a real money into a campaign-based war game, first-person war game set in the Starship Troopers universe. There are so many avenues you can go, so many different types of bugs you can come up with, so many different types of weapons you could create for that universe. It would be awesome, but nobody seems to want to extend that kind of effort. You know, it's like the up and coming Wolverine game looks great. It's like, why hasn't somebody made a game like that based on Blade? You know, a bloody R-rated Blade game with him with guns and bladed weapons fighting vampires or whatever creatures you could come up with for Blade to fight, weapons-based combat and hand-based combat. It could be awesome if somebody actually put some money into that. But instead, they just keep remaking stuff that's already been made. You know, and the whole idea of reimagining is just, again, another con. The idea that that's a favorite word in the video game industry, reimagining. It's like the most recent Tomb Raider games that came out in the past 15 years or so are referred to like a reimagining of Tomb Raider, and that's nonsense to me because the Lara Croft character is not there. And the Lara Croft character is not there. It's not Tomb Raider. It's just generic adventure game with a woman in it. You know, it's like the most recent Tomb Raider game. It's just just because you have a British woman in it and out in the wilderness doesn't make it Tomb Raider. You have to have the staples of Tomb Raider. The Lara Croft character isn't there. And it's like if you make a spy movie and with some British guy in it and he doesn't have any gadgets and doesn't sleep with women, you can't call it James Bond if you don't have the James Bond character there. That's just false advertising to put the name on it if it's not that character. The Lara Croft character that I played on video games as a child was the babe with the big tits and the little shorts and the pistols who traveled around the world on adventures, and it was silly and campy and not meant to be taken seriously. And it was funny even. And of course, the most recent Tomb Raider games is not a shred of humor. Everything is deadly serious because everything has to be deadly serious today. It's not Tomb Raider to me. The gameplay is taken directly from the Uncharted games, so not even the gameplay is unique. It's just Uncharted with a woman in it. And that always irritates me if you're going to use the name, but you're not going to give me what I paid for. And it's like Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village are even worse examples. They use the Resident Evil title and they are not Resident Evil games. Not just because they're in first person, just the general tone is nothing like Resident Evil. You don't have the protagonists are not protagonists from the Resident Evil series that had been established already. And people refer to Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village like modern versions of horror. And it's like, and I reject the idea that just having something in first person and putting you in the dark and having stuff jump out at you is modern horror. That's nonsense. That's childish. And there have been plenty of scary games that weren't in first person and didn't just put you in the dark all the time. And that's cheap horror. And more importantly, Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village are not Resident Evil games. They're Resident Evil games in name only. I said the Evil Within was more Resident Evil than those games. And I just saw the teaser trailer for the remake of Code Veronica, and again, it looks like it's going the route of Resident Evil 7 and Village, with first person stuff, it's nothing in the teaser that is the least bit Resident Evil. And it's just that stuff. It's so deceptive, and it's like maybe it's a lot of people don't care, but I care. And it's like you can't use the title and not give me what you know. It's like that awful Friday the 13th remake that was directed by the guy who directed the remake of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the remake of Friday the 13th was basically just Texas Chainsaw Massacre again. It wasn't Friday the 13th. It didn't feel like Friday the 13th. They just used the title, and that's always annoying with people when they use a title, market something as something, and it isn't that. And when you're if you're really a fan of something, you're able to recognize when something is true or when something is just the name is just being exploited. I just finished playing Mafia: The Old Country, and noticed that really something I really picked up on after a while is that third-person video games today all play the same. It doesn't matter if you will go from Uncharted to The Last of Us to Tomb Raider to Red Dead Redemption to Ghost of Tsushima to Days Gone to every third person game nowadays all plays the same, and Mafia plays just like those games. In terms of its gameplay, there's nothing that stands out. Nothing new in terms of the content or the way the game played. It's nothing that the gameplay is bad. But I say today, the gameplay, the controls of games are not frustrating. You know, the games are a lot easier to play. But with Mafia: The Old Country is like I've complained before. I said the main problem with games today is that the story is a burden and brings everything down. Especially like stories didn't always used to be a burden in video games. Stories were minimal, but I say now game developers they all seem to want to be James Cameron. You know, it's like post Titanic and Avatar, especially. Um, all these people seem to think that the more cliche the story is, the more successful it will be. That the more everyone knows what's going to happen before it happens, the better. They feel like they honestly think that. And all of the BS in this game with the Mafia Don's daughter and this star-crossed lover BS, it was so cringy. It reminded me of Attack of the Clones, man. Well, I was rolling my eyes every time that the Mafia Don's daughter appeared in the game. And of course, the game has to end with you playing as her. And it always brought the game. Even without her, the game wasn't anything extraordinary, but it brought the game down so much. Because I have never in my life ever cared about a love story in a video game. I've felt emotions playing some video games, tension, or when the game really makes me feel like I am that character when he's a blank slate. I might, if occasionally, care about what happens to another character and want to help them, but when I'm being forced to sit back and through these cutscenes with these awful love stories in video games, I have never cared at all. Especially in recent memory, I have not cared about any related. When now that they hire actors and do motion capturing of their performances and all that, I do not care at all what these CGI people are doing. And I say because there's never any mature representations of adult relationships in these games. There's no wit, there's no self-awareness, there's not a shred of humor, and particularly in the Mafia, the Old Country, there's none of this. There's no self-awareness ever. It takes itself so seriously. It is so melodramatic, because I say the video game industry is so connected to Hollywood now. The more as a film goer, the more films you watch, the more you can tell the difference between serious filmmakers and hack filmmakers. Just because somebody takes themselves seriously doesn't mean that you should take them seriously. There are a lot of films that seem serious in tone, want you to believe they're serious, but they aren't. And this game is like that. It so takes itself so seriously, but it's not. It's not written for adults. You know, there's no in something that's written for adults. There is nuance to the performances, and the characters feel like real people. You don't know what they're going to say before they say it. And it's games like Mafia: The Old Country are it doesn't show any respect for the gamer at all. And it's written. seem to be written for children, written for adolescents, and it has an adolescent view of what adult relationships are like and what adult life is like. The characters are like a figment of someone's imagination, or they're just cookie cutter. You know, and I was just, and some people say, oh well, the game is M-rated and it has blood and gore. It's like, and then of course plenty of violence, but there's no sexual content or nudity or anything to be found in the game. Even though there are prostitutes and stuff in there, there's none of that. And juvenile minds love sadistic violence more than anything else. Scared to death of sex, but they love violence. It's that it reminds me of one of those Quentin Tarantino geeks that Tarantino love in his movies. He loves sadistic violence, but you don't find any nudity or sex in his movies. And that's how you know you're dealing with the juvenile mind. And these video games are so full of so much violence and all that, but there's nothing in it that makes it feel like it's really made for adults. It's made for juveniles. The gaming industry now seems to be just out to appeal to compulsive consumers, people who feel a sense of obligation to buy their products. Game developers seem to be, out to try to appeal to the same people who go to McDonald's or patronizes Disney, or people who still support WWE. People who just do it out of habit, conditioned consumers. And there are a lot of gamers out there that seem to be conditioned to think that all of this, of what's occurred over the last 20 years, is normal. you know and it's like, and I said before, I was always a console gamer. I used to buy consoles and play exclusively console games. Now I'm exclusively a PC gamer. It's like I bought a new PC this year that can play virtually any video game, and I played games that I've been wanting to play for years, like Ratchet and Clank, Rift Apart, and Spider-Man 2, and RoboCop, and more recent stuff like Doom: The Dark Ages and Resident Evil Requiem. Um, because Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart was great. All the Ratchet and Clank games are great. Spider-Man 2, the gameplay was great, but again, that's one of those games where the story was a burden and the gameplay wasn't really any better than the previous games. RoboCop was a surprise in terms of how I couldn't imagine really a better RoboCop game. I can imagine better animation of character faces and more money being put into it. But in terms of a video game of RoboCop, I didn't really expect much, and that game was better than I expected it to be. Especially being a huge fan of the original film, it's kind of hard not to enjoy that game. Doom: The Dark Ages, thoroughly enjoyed it. I can't say it was better than the previous two games, especially Doom Eternal, but I didn't have any serious problems with the game, and from the beginning, there's no point that I not enjoyed the experience. And Resident Evil Requiem was half great, half terrible, because half of the game is like Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village. That was the bad part. Everything with Leon was great. And and I have to say that playing these games, I didn't pay to play any of these games. I found ways to play these games without having to pay. And and I have to say I'm done with consoles really, because like the PS5 came out years ago. I refused to buy it because there's not enough games to justify the purchase. That's why I waited so long to buy a PC to play these games. I'm not buying a PS5 just to play Ratchet and Clank and Spider-Man 2. It's not. It's ridiculous. Console gaming is too expensive. And I mean, $70 for a game is ridiculous. I mean, in the 90s, people were outraged when Superman 64 was selling for $70. And now everybody thinks that's okay. I would never pay $70 for a video game. And because games are so expensive, that's why fewer games come out. And like back when I stopped playing video games in early 2000s, console cycles saw 3 or 4 entries in a series. It's like 3 Siphon Filter games came out just in a few years. Ratchet and Clank on the PS2, like 3 or 4 games came out just in a few years. You know, they're home. Whereas now you're lucky to find one game in a franchise in within a 10-year cycle. It's ridiculous because these games cost so much to make, and the consoles themselves have gone up so much in price. We're like in the early 2000s, the console, like the GameCube, was $200. The Xbox was $300 when it came out. Now these games, the console, the prices are just keep going up to the point where it's not worth the investment. I mean, buying a console for one because of one game you want to play made sense when the consoles were cheaper. There were a lot of people who bought the Xbox just to play Halo, and you'll do that when the consoles were cheaper. But when the console's getting up near $1,000 or something to buy, you're not going to buy it. No intelligent person will buy it just because of one game. Especially today when so many games play like every other game. You know, so few games that stand out in terms of the gameplay. And the whole idea of digital purchases and people buying consoles and having a digital library on the console rather than physical copies is something I will never get into ever. If you don't own a physical copy of it, you don't own it to me. It's like, it's funny, even my stepfather is fine with that. He's older than me, and yet he has no problem with digital purchases and rather than physical copies. Like, to me, I will never be down with just downloading something and thinking that that's owning it. No, I have to have a physical copy of something to say that I own it. I totally understand why there's a whole culture of people that only play older games now. You know, I wish game developers cared more about the gameplay than the realistic graphics and trying to be film directors. The games used to be about game design and the challenge and fun. It wasn't about the story. The story was always archetypal and cliche, but it wasn't lingered upon. They would have like an introductory screen telling you what the narrative is in shorthand, and then as you play the game, you'd gradually get little updates, but it wasn't lingered upon. Whereas now the games are so expensive, they linger on everything. And if the story has offensive elements, it's going to totally take you out of the enjoyment of playing the game. And it's gotten to the point now to where nerds spend more time talking about the scripts of video games than the gameplay when they criticize the game. They talking about the story. They don't talk about the game design. They talk about the damn story, which is because they've been conditioned to think that's the most important thing. It's like I don't recall anyone critiquing the script of Super Mario Brothers 3, but they talked about how great the game was. And as a child, I didn't detect any contempt on the part of game developers as a child. You know, I thought the video game industry was kid friendly as a kid. You know, then as a teenager, as games were becoming three dimensional, I still didn't detect any contempt on the part of the gaming industry. You know, I had a fondness for it. I used to read gaming magazines, and the gaming magazines often would have like demo discs in them to get me excited about a game that was coming out, and I used to pay a lot of attention as to when certain games were coming out, look forward to it. Yeah. As an adult returning to video games in 2020, I've seen so many games emulate Hollywood and repeat a lot of the insidious, mean-spirited messages found in Hollywood films. And I never thought the gaming industry would just be full of a lot of Hollywood hacks. And the gaming industry now is something that I don't feel that the gaming industry is gamer friendly anymore. Eh, And it seems to be going out of its way to try to shove certain people out of out of the industry up to because how can you be with the expenses and everything going up? How a lot of people aren't going to be able to buy this stuff because it's too expensive. And I like video games. I never there was a period of my life when I didn't have really have time for it. It wasn't a place for it in my life, but I like video games and I still even as an adult I enjoy playing them, but I don't want to support the video game industry, which is why I said I don't buy video games anymore. I find ways to play them without having to pay for them. I refuse to buy any video game. And in that respect, again, the video game industry is a lot like Hollywood because the Hollywood movies are so bad to me now, I don't even pay to see any Hollywood movies. Well, that's something I just had to get off of my chest because that's something that's just been, over the past few years, just been gnawing away at me. The more games I played and just seeing the same thing over and over again and going back 20 years at what was becoming a problem and how so much of it has gotten worse and that the gaming industry seems to be run by people who don't really seem to be interested in video games anymore. Um, that's all I have to say. Thank you.